Fantastic. So welcome everybody to the Sense of Place in Contemporary Fiction panel. We are delighted to have you all here, and I am hugely excited to welcome you to our panel of brilliant authors that we have with us tonight, including Trevor Wood, Nikki Smith, Heather Darwent, Hilary Taylor, and Tom Benjamin, and me, who is Philippa East. So we're going to kick off with just quickly going around and introducing ourselves before we dive into our topic for this evening. As I've mentioned before, please do feel free to ask questions as we go along, and yeah, pop them in the chat. And we are very happy to kind of zig and zag our conversation to talk about what's most interesting for you guys. So I will kick off introducing myself. So yeah, as I say, obviously I'm Philippa East. I'm the author of 3 psychological suspense novels with HQ HarperCollins. My debut is Little White Lies. My second book is Safe and Sound, which is set in Brixton, and I have brought along a little prop from Brixton, which is a real life Brixton pound, which is legal currency in Brixton in South London. And so my book Safe and Sound is set in Brixton, and my third book, which is I'll Never Tell, is set in Oxford, which is where I did my undergraduate degree. And I have brought along the lovely hat that I got to wear at my graduation ceremony. And then actually, did I have to wear them for exams? No, I think just my graduation. So yes, I am reliving my Oxford experiences. So let us meet our other lovely panelists today. Trevor, would you like to kick us off and say a little bit about yourself, your books and your settings?
Of course, I don't have any props, so apologies. I do have one book. I'm Trevor Wood. I'm the author of the Jimmy Mullen trilogy, which began with the award-winning The Man on the Street and is set very firmly in Newcastle's homeless community. I also have a new standalone book coming out a week on Thursday, which is called You Can Run and looks like that. And that one is set in a very remote Northumberland village.
Fantastic. Thank you, Trevor. Let's go to Nikki Smith next.
Hi, I'm Nikki Smith. I'm the author of 2 published novels. My debut was called All in Her Head, and I also wrote Look What You Made Me Do. And my third novel, which is called The Beach Party, which I think you can see behind me there, is out on the 6th of July this year. And I have a little prop. There we go, you might be able to see that because it's set in Mallorca. So I've got some little postcards with Mallorca on that my publisher very kindly did for me, with some palm trees and things like that. So yes, that's me.
Fantastic, thank you, Nikki. And next we have Heather Darwent. Tell us about yourself, Heather Darwent.
Hello, my name is Heather. I am a debut author, so I've just got one book, and it's called Things We Do to Our Friends. It just came out in January, and it's set in the world of Edinburgh University, and yeah, very focused on Edinburgh, which is where I live, and also with bits set in France as well.
Fantastic. And Hilary, let's hear a little bit about you and your fantastic book.
I'm Hilary Taylor, and this is my debut novel, which was also published in January. It's called Sea Defences, and I'm going to try and show you my prop. It's on a shared screen, so here we go. This is the setting of my novel, and it's about a little girl who goes missing on this very beach. So there it is. Oh, now my screen's gone funny.
You'll come back, Hilary, it'll be fine. Yeah.
Hillary's screen has been doing this all evening before we started the panel itself, and it's fantastic. We absolutely love it. It's an effect that we've never seen before. So you guys who are here tonight are absolutely privileged to see this never before seen Zoom glitch.
I think it's all right now.
Yeah. And last but absolutely not least, Tom, do you want to tell us about your fantastic book set in Bologna in Italy?
Yes, well, hello everyone. I'm Tom Benjamin, the author of 4 now Bologna set mysteries featuring an English detective, Daniel Lester, who's walking the mean porticos of Bologna. I don't really have any props because I'm actually living in my setting, so to speak, but it's dark outside, so that's not really going to help very much. But I was looking around desperately when Philippa was talking about this, and I was thinking, well, what can I use for props? Well, here's one I found. This is a bit of some of my research. Here's a prop. It's about criminal cases in Bologna, which I probably bought because it was 50% off. And here's another old book that I found by a lady who was writing about the history of Bologna, and it was the only history book of Bologna that I could find in English, and it was written in about 1900 when she came here, and it's full of wonderful old photographs of Bologna. It's fantastic. But yes, so my latest book, Italian Rules, comes out this May, and it's, well, basically it says, when Hollywood comes to Bologna, la dolce vita turns to sweet murder. So that should give you a taste of what my book's about.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm popping a link in the chat right now, which if any of these books take your fancy, I've set up a little bookshelf on bookshop.org, which is a great online site supporting independent bookshops. And you can find all the books of all our panelists there, read a little bit more about them, and if you like the sound of them, then yeah, grab a copy. So yeah, I've just popped the link in the chat, so feel free to check that out. Okay, so let's start talking about setting and sense of place in our writing and our novels, which is something that which I think none of us can avoid, right? But maybe it's not something we talk about that explicitly. So I thought it'd be quite fun to really get into this evening. So let's start with just thinking about when you're approaching a novel, do you think about the setting and the locations kind of early on or up front or first? Or is that something that will often come much later, for example, after you've got your characters and your plot and things worked out? So maybe I'm going to start with you, Tom, because maybe you're maybe someone who's got a most obvious answer to this question, or a most simple one.
The easiest one, probably, yeah.
And actually, Kate, sorry, just to say, Kate Galley in the chat has asked pretty much this exact question, so that's handy. And Helen McDonald, I've spotted your question as well, because you prefaced it nicely with question in capital letters, so we will come to you as well. So anyway, yeah, Tom, tell us a little bit about
yeah, I mean, I certainly began with the setting. I mean, I've been writing novels for years without much success, and really, when I came to Bologna, we came to live in Bologna about 15 years ago. I never actually initially thought about using Bologna as a setting, funnily enough. But it was when I was actually working in my first sort of job, trying to get to grips with the language and so on. And I was working on the door of a canteen for homeless and other vulnerable people, that I was experiencing a kind of a totally different kind of Italy to the Italy that most people were familiar with. And I was thinking, wow, this is just like really fascinating. And I was learning so much about Bologna and Italy that I never really would have come across had I kind of approached the experience in the traditional manner. And I think that was my initial inspiration. It was this kind of want to sort of sort of describe the world about me, because I thought it was so new and fascinating, would be interesting to readers. But I didn't really have an in until I came across a book called Naples 44 by Norman Lewis. And he was a diarist who became quite famous in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, maybe, for writing about his travels in various places, including Sicily. But a book was published by him, which was his wartime diaries, when he was a secret policeman in Naples, which was then occupied by the Allies. And it's just one of the most, fascinating and fantastic non-fiction books that I'd ever read. And I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to sort of talk about Bologna from the perspective of a sort of a British sort of policeman or a private detective? And that became my in, and that became my kind of way to kind of unravel the mystery of Italy that I found myself in, basically. So that was really how I started very much with the setting, but for me it was more a struggle about how to communicate and how to share the experience of living in this country to a wider audience.
That's really interesting, Tom, having read all of your books, even the one that's not properly out yet, and loved them all. It's really, because I sort of feel like, because they're set in Bologna and that's where you live and that's such an integral part. I never even really crossed my mind that there was a stage where you wouldn't planning to write a book set in Bologna. And what about
sorry, carry on.
I'm just going to move on to Heather, if that's okay. So Heather, your book, which I've also read and loved, feels so integrally tied up with Edinburgh. But so again, was it that you having experience of that location yourself meant you always wanted to write a book set in Edinburgh? Or again, did the storyline come first, then you thought, Edinburgh University would fit really well with that?
Yeah, no, the setting absolutely came first for me. So, and I think maybe this is quite common for debuts, but I use a lot of my own life for my debut. So my book is set at Edinburgh University. I also went to Edinburgh University, and I just, as soon as I kind of arrived in Edinburgh, I'd grown up in like a really small village. I just fell in love with Edinburgh as a city straight away, and loved writing about it. And started writing the book, and ended up putting all these really long descriptions about Edinburgh in it. And my editor was like, it's a bit much, for a thriller, like a really long description of a statue. So for me, it was almost like there was maybe a bit too much setting in originally for the genre. And I had to kind of claw it back. I don't know if anyone else has found this, but I was like drawn to kind of putting a lot of detail in. But yeah, it was always going to be set in Edinburgh. And lockdown hit, and I couldn't kind of get, because I live outside of Edinburgh, I couldn't kind of get to Edinburgh. So I was having to kind of imagine what the streets were like. But yeah.
Oh yeah, fantastic. And yeah, I know I can totally relate to what you mean about like when we're really, really passionate about a particular aspect of our novel, whether it's setting or whether it's something else, like we put like so much in it, and our editors are a bit like, I don't think we need all of this.
Yeah, you almost need someone to pull it back for you and just be like, just a sentence is enough.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to come to you next, Trevor, because obviously your series, or your trilogy, as you rightly call it, is set very much in your hometown of Newcastle, but you've also got your standalone You Can Run, which is got a different location. So yeah, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about kind of, are you similar to Tom in how setting has kind of come for you, and what was it like moving to your standalone? And also Angela Lady wants you to also mention what your inspiration for You Can Run is. And okay,
I met Angela at the Bay Tales Festival on Saturday for the first time. She came a long way to come and see us. It was nice to meet her, and I know she's from the northeast, so she's obviously interested in the setting. And mine's a little bit like Tom. Hillary's going mad again here. I don't know.
Sorry, I could also hear someone frantically typing in the background, so I'll just remind everybody again. Oh, hang on, I've spotted who they are.
It's probably me.
No, it's not. It's not. Okay, we're sorted now.
I'll crack on.
I'm just doing everything wrong.
No, it's not you, Hill. Don't worry.
Okay.
It's fine. I found the culprit. I wouldn't name them, but I found them. Okay, go on, Trevor.
Okay, no worries. So a little bit like a combination of Heather and Tom, really. Like Tom, I do live in Newcastle. I wanted to set my book here because I mean, as you can hear, I'm not originally from Newcastle, but I've lived there for 30 years. And I had a kind of peripatetic lifestyle before then. I moved all over the place when I was a kid. I joined the Navy as soon as I could at 18. I moved all over the country. So the first time I really settled was when I came to Newcastle about 30 years ago. And I loved it almost immediately. And I read somewhere, somebody said that if you love a place, you always want to share it with somebody else. So partially, I wanted to convince the rest of the world that Newcastle is the best city in the country. But also, primarily, I was setting my book in the homeless community, and it really has to be in a city if you're going to do that. There's not much point setting it in a homeless community in a tiny village because you'll have a very small cast of characters. So it was always going to be set in Newcastle. The standalone is completely different, really, because of the nature of the story, which is about a small village being held at siege as a group of strange soldiers look for a young girl. It had to be somewhere very remote, so I had to move it out of Newcastle. But luckily, Newcastle is right on the borders of Northumberland, which is probably the least populated county in the country, and it's huge, wide open spaces. So I didn't have to go too far.
And Trevor, I'm just going to chip in here because I think you're very helpfully kind of answering Helen McDonald's question. So I'm going to just point out that she has a question, so that, because it's really lovely what you're saying just now, because she says, does your approach to setting or place differ depending on whether you're writing a standalone novel or a series? And I think you're the only one of us who's done both. So it's really helpful what you're saying, and yeah, maybe you can keep elaborating on that a little bit more to
so very explicitly, I couldn't set the standalone in Newcastle as much as I would have liked to, because having some strange mercenaries blockading the entire city of Newcastle would probably be a bit of a stretch to the imagination, but doing it to a very small village in Northumberland was feasible. So I clearly had to move location there. And I do like to make my locations real, so I like it to be a place that I can easily visit and walk around. So the local area was the obvious one to do it. I do also have a couple of maps. Shall I do those now?
Sure.
I didn't have any props earlier, so now I've got props. You probably won't be able to see this because the version online is not that clear, but that is a map of Newcastle, but drawn by an artist after going around talking to homeless people about how they saw the city. So it's full of detail about where you might sleep, or where you might get a free cup of coffee, or where you don't want to sleep because it's dangerous. And I found it very early on in my research, and I was looking at it the other day for the first time in ages, because the first book in the series came out in 2020. But there are things on there that I saw. I slept behind Greg's. It was warm, but the police moved me on. Well, that's in the book. There's another one where he said, I slept in Lees's Park, but the police threw me out. That's in the book as well. And I thought, God, I stole a lot from this map. And in contrast, I have a little map here of the small village in Northumberland, which was drawn by my wife, based on a terrible drawing that I did, which was literally straight lines and a word that said trees here and stuff like that. Sadly, when I sent that to my publishers, they said, oh, that's a great idea. We'll give it to an artist to do it properly. So I'm not sure my wife's speaking to me after that. But a map's very useful, I think. And the homeless map was incredibly useful to me.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I ended up answering any of those questions there, but
yes, let's say that you did.
Yeah, let's say that.
Comment in the chat if you feel that Trevor didn't. Hilary, I've seen that you've rejoined us again, still warping at light speed through all sorts of parallel universes there. But I would like to come to you next to talk a little bit about, particularly thinking about your book.
Oh dear. Hold on, let me just.
Don't worry about it, Hill. I think it'll be absolutely fine.
Okay, all right. Shall we just ignore it?
Yeah, put your video back on, otherwise you won't show
Yeah.
at all, which is a shame.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So obviously in your book, the setting is really, really evocative, and it's very entwined with the characters and the storyline. So again, I'm interested for you, did setting come, was that quite primary in you developing the ideas for the book, or secondary? And also Joanne Baird has asked a really good question here, which we might all chip in on, but I think I'd be curious about your answer to this as well, which is it tempting to invent a setting, or is it important to you that your novels are set in real places? And I think this is always quite an interesting one, about how much we fictionalize our locations versus try and be, make them the real places that people would walk around. So yeah.
So my novel is set on the North Norfolk coast, and it's real in the sense that the North Norfolk coast is real, obviously, but it's a fictional village based on a sort of amalgamation of various places. So I chose to make it a fictional village so that I could sort of make things up about it. But the surrounding countryside and coast in particular are the real thing. And my novel is based on a short story that I had written, and the setting, as you say, the setting is very integral to the action, and the title Sea Defences is really a metaphor of what happens, how the characters defend themselves against the things that life throws at them. So it really had to be set on this fragile, crumbling coastline where storms attack and so on. So it was, it's definitely not secondary. It's very much intertwined with the action and the characters and the themes of the book. So it definitely came first, or at the same time as the plot and the characters. Yeah.
And did you see any particular advantages in, as you say, kind of making a fictionalized version, which, as you say, was an amalgamation? Because I've done similar things in, I did it in Little White Lies, which is set in Lincolnshire. It's a sort of mashup of Sleaford and Grantham. Was there any particular reason why you wanted to do that? There's pros and cons both ways, I think, of making it real and making it a sort of blurry version of something recognizable.
I think it was because I didn't want to be constrained by the facts. Because I like making things up. So I didn't want anyone to read it and say, but this place is not like that.
Fantastic. So I'm going to come to you, Nikki, last but not least, and as well as kind of the original question, which is about, does setting come sort of early for you or later? But we also have a lovely question from Jacqueline Sutherland, specifically about The Beach Party, which obviously is your next one that is coming out, which I have also read and massively loved. And Jacqueline's question is, what made you want to do a destination thriller this time? And how did you find it different from the sort of settings and sort of subgenre of your previous books?
Yes, I guess, my first two novels, I think, were probably, psychological thrillers, I guess you'd define them as. And my first book, All in Her Head, the location for that definitely came first. It was inspired by a news article that I read, and without wanting to give too much away of the plot, the Bristol Suspension Bridge features primarily in the book, and so that's where I knew I wanted to set it. I'd never actually been to Bristol, so I did a lot of Google Map, little man walking around on my screen, and kind of went around that way. I have since visited Bristol, obviously, but I hadn't kind of when I wrote the book. So it was, for that one, it was definitely, I guess, destination was a kind of, that was the primary factor. My second book, I would say, much less so. It could be kind of, it's an amalgamation of a lot of places I visited in the south of England, the particular kind of town, village where it's set. So it wasn't, I don't think setting is so important. And then, but obviously my third novel that's coming out in July, Yes, setting's very important because it's set in Mallorca. And I don't think I actually set out to write a destination thriller. I think what happened was I visited Dagger in Mallorca, where the book's actually set, just before COVID and lockdown. So I went there with a group of school friends or friends that I've been kind of friends with university, actually, friends. So for like 20 years, we went there in October, just before kind of COVID hit. And I think it was the last place that I'd been to when we all went into lockdown and everything got pretty nasty, and you were staring at the kind of four walls of your kitchen and everything. And it was that place that I just kept thinking about. It was gorgeous, and it was the last place that I'd felt like, oh, we were kind of free and we got to walk around and everything was fine, and we didn't know that this was going to happen. So I knew I wanted to include it in a book, but I just didn't necessarily, I'd say, start out thinking I was going to write a destination thriller. It was just a thriller set in Mallorca. But I think that obviously now with brands and genres, it gets called a destination thriller. But to me, it's just, a thriller that's set in a different country. Well, most of it's set in a different country and in a different time, because it's 1980s for most of it. Well, it kind of flashes backwards and forwards, but a lot of it is, set in the 1980s.
Fantastic. That's a really good point as well, Nikki, about when we talk about setting, we're also talking about time settings, aren't we? Although this one we're focusing geographical locations, but actually that's a whole other element to it, the setting of your book in time, because that makes a world of difference as well, doesn't it, in terms of the whole backdrop of your book. And I'm going to come to myself next with this, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to answer Zoe Richards' question as well. Zoe says, my novel, hopefully to be my debut. Yes, absolutely, Zoe. We are rooting for you. We believe in you. She says, my novel, hopefully to be my debut, is based on the Merseyside coast north of Liverpool. I find myself worrying at times that a publisher might tell me to change the place that the plot is set in, with it being northern. Have any of you been told that you need to change the place you choose to set the novel in? First of all, Zoe, I don't understand why we wouldn't want a northern setting, given, oh, hang on, I've got somebody typing in the background. Let me just see if I can spot our culprit. No, anyway, but yeah, I can't see why a publisher would object to a northern setting. Like we're just saying, Trevor's books are set in the north. Heather's book is set in Edinburgh. I have northern settings in my books, and I think that actually those kind of settings are very unique and very vivid, I think. And yeah, I think that would be a great setting.
Can I jump in, Philippa?
Yeah, Trevor. Yeah.
I would say I think Liverpool's a great setting for a book, and I don't think anybody would worry about that. I think the only pushback I've ever had is on not using too much dialect that's local. So I have a kind of unwritten agreement with my editor that I've got about 12 Geordie words that I can drop in here and there, and I only use very specific characters who speak Geordie. It'd be very weird to set a book in Newcastle and not have anybody talking with any kind of Geordie accent. So I use a limited number of words that make it very clear where they are, and I restrict them to one or two characters. So I would say don't use too much dialect unless you feel really, really strongly about it.
Good advice.
And I'd also add, the only other thing, I guess, is that if you wanted to sell a book to America, having any particular area that's very specific to the UK, I think that makes it quite difficult. Not that that's something that you necessarily have to think about at all, but it's just a point.
I'd second that. I think that's very true. I've found that problem certainly with foreign deals. I do have 2 Scandinavian deals, which probably tells a story about the connection between the Northeast and Scandinavia, but nowhere else. And I think people tell me that's because of the Newcastle setting. But to be honest, write the book you want to write in the place you want to write, and worry about that later.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And to answer your question, Zoe, I have had experience of being told or suggested that I change the setting of or one of the settings in my book. So in I'll Never Tell, which is the one in which teenage violinist Chrissy goes missing. Initially, it was set in Oxford, and then Chrissy's parents went hunting for her in, of all places, Panama. Now, I've never been to Panama. I don't know anyone who lives in Panama. The only reason I decided to set it in Panama was because I'd once watched a documentary series about a group of people who set up a commune, or was it a cult, in the jungles of Panama. And I was like, oh yeah, this is so good, and I want to write about a jungle in Panama. But quite rightly, my editor said, I just don't think this setting fits the story. It just feels too random. It feels too exotic. It feels too complicated that any teenager would end up in Panama. And we went back and forth, and I no spoilers, I won't tell you where we did change the setting to, but we did change it. And so I think that probably that, yeah, you know, if a setting isn't working for a book or isn't showing off the story in the best way, then yes, you might be asked to change it. But actually, if, again, like Trevor's books, like Heather's book, like Nikki's book, like all of our books, if the setting is such a big part of the story itself, I don't see why a publisher would have an issue with that. So go for it, Zoe. Okay, so moving on a little bit. So we've got some other great questions, which I will try and
you wrote the questions, Philippa.
No, I mean, great questions
in the chat room.
In the chat. I mean, my questions are great too, obviously, but you know, there are great questions in the chat too. So we've got a nice one from let me just find it. Yes, here we go. So this is from Bettina Hartas, who represents Trip Fiction, which we all love, who love to kind of delve into the particular settings in different books that are out there in the market. And I know that a number of us have had books featured on Trip Fiction, which is fantastic. And thank you, Bettina, for that fantastic service that you do and all the information that you share. But you're asking about, you've asked a couple of things. How much is too much setting in a book? And also you're asking, how important is it to visit the setting of your book? So I suppose let's kind of make that a sort of general question about, yeah, how do we present the settings in our books in a ways that feel realistic but don't over dominate? And that's, I suppose that connects as well with some other questions, like this nice one from, let me just double check, Casey Chamberlain, talking about, do you think the setting or place, even if fictional, influences your characters' personal details? So you guys can answer any or all of those questions about getting the balance of setting right, whether you like to visit settings to really write them realistically, and how you weave the idea of setting in with characterization. Heather, let's start with you this time.
Drop my pen. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. So yeah, I did visit Edinburgh a lot because I did write the majority of the book before lockdown, and I kind of ended up just kind of wandering around. And then actually for kind of internal scenes, I tend to find it hard to write about houses or flats that I haven't been to. So I tend to kind of go on like Zoopla and like find a house and download the floor plan. And then that becomes like the floor plan of like the place that I'm writing about. So I've stolen some houses that are for sale for that aspect of it. And I think it's for me, then I don't have to kind of worry about when someone was moving from the drawing room to the dining room and where that kind of was. And I don't know if anyone else does that. So I do that. And then I think for me as well with setting, like it's a bit of a tricky one. I think I've definitely, in terms of going back to that thing about have we ever been asked to move settings, for me some of it's about kind of balance in the book, and I think quite a lot of us here write thrillers and write books where there's quite a strong emphasis on pace. And you know, I'll write a scene. There was a particular instance in my debut where I wrote a scene in a park and then another scene in another park like two very similar scenes of characters having conversations in parks that were different and described, and it was kind of like these scenes feel quite monotonous because they're both in very similar settings. So for me, setting is also a really good way to kind of mix things up in terms of plot. So moving the action somewhere else and the kind of setting becomes part of the action is kind of more of a device as well, I guess. Yeah, I think that's it. But yeah, I end up using a lot of pictures as well, but floor plans is like my secret arsenal for especially like Edinburgh houses. They've got like amazing floor plans you can download.
Fantastic. And what about you, Hilary? You know, how do you sort of get the right balance of how much setting, you know, to put in, and how you kind of get setting straight in your head? And yeah, I guess, you know, in your book, there's a real sense of the setting being a character and really presenting the themes of the book. So yeah, how do you kind of go about that?
Well, I spend and have spent a lot of time on the North Norfolk coast, walking on the beach and on the cliffs in all weathers and all seasons. So obviously that experience, you know, sort of immersing myself in the setting helped with that. And as to how much setting or how little, well, I think I don't really separate. I haven't really thought about setting as separate from the rest of the book. So all the way through, it's just very much intertwined with the characters and how they're feeling and what they're doing and the themes of the book. So if I have a description of the setting, it's very much from the point of view of one of the characters. The novel has 3 point of view characters. And so any of the descriptions are definitely through the eyes of one of the characters, and will always have in them, you know, something about how the setting affects the character, how it affects their choices, and, you know, mood signaling and all that sort of thing. So I've never really thought of it as, oh, let's have a bit of setting in now. It's just, you know, running all the way through. So that's how I look at it, really.
And yeah, I think sometimes they are so entwined, aren't they? And I think I really like that point you make about presenting the setting to the reader through the character's point of view. I mean, I guess it can depend a little bit if we're maybe writing from the kind of omniscient narrator perspective versus a kind of close third or first person. But I think that idea that, yeah, the characters' reactions to the setting and how they are experiencing the setting, and again that having an influence on their actions and reactions. And yeah, like you say, not separating it out, not like, oh, let's have a clunk of, you know, let's describe the scenery right now and then go back to the story. Actually trying to think of them as together. Yeah,
there were a couple of things that in the editing process that my editor asked me to describe this fictional village a bit more. So I did have to go back and put a few more descriptive bits in. But I did make sure that I did what I've just described, and had the characters within those descriptions, sort of thing.
Yeah. And Tom, what about you? How do you kind of, because again, yeah, I mean, your books are so focused on Bologna, and that's such a big part of the whole backdrop for everything, really. How do you kind of balance plot and setting, and yeah, kind of the interaction between setting and characters? How do you do it?
I mean, very much what Hilary was saying, really. Ironically, for someone for whom kind of, you know, setting was very much my kind of starting point, I didn't actually give how the setting would be perceived a great deal of thought, in so much as, you know, I thought that this was really fascinating. So when I started writing about it, you know, I wrote the novel, and you know, Bologna is the home of the Italian mystery fiction, you know, known as the gialli or the giallo. Because it's full of porticos, and it's got this funny weather, and there's lots of sort of mist, and it's, you know, it's known as being a very kind of mysterious place, and so it kind of just lent itself to fiction and to literature in that sense. But when I started sending the book out, I got an agent, for example, who was very interested in, another lovely book about Italy, and so she kind of like read it, and then she kind of called me up and she said, but it's always raining and there's all this graffiti and there's all these kind of punks and this and that, and it's just not my idea of Italy at all. I go to Tuscany every year and it's lovely and it's and it hadn't even occurred to me, I thought this city is so intrinsically fascinating and so intrinsically different, and in fact the city of Bologna is the kind of unspoken character of the novel, one of the main characters. I hadn't actually thought of that side of it, that actually it's not a bit like, Trevor, who's setting it in Newcastle, the kind of readership who's interested in Italy, or they're not going to kind of like say, oh yeah, I've always wanted to go, no offense, Trevor, but I've always wanted to go to Newcastle. I must read a book about Newcastle. But, obviously there is an element of people who are thinking, who kind of have this kind of under the Tuscan sun experience of Italy. And I didn't want to write Under the Tuscan Sun with Murders. I wanted to sort of present Italy as it is. And, coming back to this idea of Norman Lewis, almost a kind of documentary experience of what Italy is really like within the context of a crime story. And so, yeah, that's been something I've really had to balance. And in the first book, I tend to get the roughest reviews from the first book, actually, because it is the kind of, there's lots of politics, there's lots of rain, there's lots of graffiti and so on. And then as I move through the other books, and explore different aspects of Bologna, it's perhaps a little less rainy, a little less wet, there's a little less graffiti. But I do try to be very, very true, and because that's the whole point of me writing the books. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point in me writing them if I was just going to do the Under the Tuscan Sun business. So yeah, it's kind of granular, the identity of Bologna in the novels. But hopefully not always off-putting, hopefully always interesting.
Brilliant. And coming to you, Nikki, because again, going back to what you were saying about how in your first two books, setting perhaps wasn't so important. Like one of them, it was a kind of generic English town. But with The Beach Party, like you say, it's being marketed as a destination thriller, and the setting is, again, really core to the whole storyline. How did you find it quite different? Again, did that present more of a challenge of having to think about these questions of like balancing how much, you're putting setting on the page and how you learn more about kind of how setting and character and plot all interact compared to your other two? And do you have any kind of insights or tips about how you grew as a writer as a result of focusing on setting?
I don't know about grew, Philippa. I don't know about grew. I mean, obviously, the destination is incredibly important, and I want readers to feel, this kind of luxury villa and experience that. So, there is that element of it, but it's all a balance, I think, isn't it? You've got to love the characters in the book, and if it's a thriller, you've got to be able to follow the plot, and it's got to be pacey. So you don't want the kind of as you say, the descriptions to take over that. I don't think too much. So it's just kind of working out, where the kind of balance is. But obviously, I had to think, I think, a lot more about where I was setting it and the kind of bit more on the details and about the area and things like that. But I think because it was the last place that I had visited before lockdown, it was very clear in my mind, and I had loads of pictures. I'd been there. I do what Heather does as well. I go on to websites and nick house ideas. I've got some lovely villas that are currently in my kind of research folder, which I can kind of flip back to and think, quite like to live there, quite like that one. So I kind of nick bits out of lots of different places and then kind of put it together. But I think it's it is a balance. You can't just describe the place because people aren't going to be interested in that at all. It's got to be there, but it's got to feel like it's just part of the book, I think, so that people can focus on the characters and focus on the plot, but understand where they are at all times and actually feel like they're in that particular place that you've set the book.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we've got quite a good consensus on that, haven't we? That there has to be real organic interweaving of these different elements. And I think
somebody asked, oh sorry, I was just going to say, I think someone asked a question about food and setting, and I think that was something definitely that I had in this book. I knew like proper kind of dishes that were kind of cooked in Mallorca and things like that, and so food was definitely a part of it for this particular book.
Absolutely. I have spotted Casey's question and I've got a note to come to that. And also you've really nicely answered another question of Casey's, which she's just put up, which was, if you created a fictional setting, would it be made of snaps of places you've already been or know? And I think that's what you're saying you did with this, that you were looking at different pictures in brochures or things that you had come across, and then sort of weaving that together to make your unique fictional.
I think my books tend to be very visual, and I think I'm quite a visual person, so that just helps me when I do my research. I like to either have physically been to that particular place, ideally, but particularly if it's luxurious, I will always go to that place. But if I can't go there for whatever reason, then I need to have seen something to be able to kind of write about it.
Yeah, interesting. And so it's kind of getting to the kind of sharp edge of the discussion now, which is trying to maybe distill some of these ideas and sort of general principles that we've been talking about down into maybe some more specific writing techniques. So again, this maybe covers a couple of questions that people have put up. So Kingsley has, again, hi Kingsley, and again, congratulations on your recent successes with your writing. So Kingsley was asking about, again, I just want to check how you phrased it because it was nice. If I can't find it, I'll just try and make my own guff way of how you said it. But Kingsley was basically, kind of asking about, how do we want, here we go. What effects on the reader do you like your settings to have, and how do you try and achieve this? So I think, this is getting into if we have any specific, tips on how we create that, how we use setting to create certain feelings in the reader or certain imagery for the reader, or engage them in the book. Again, I wanted to link this with Casey's question about whether we might use things like references to specific foods, which I guess is really tapping into those senses we don't always think about, like taste and smell, as more than just vision and hearing. And also Helen McDonald had a nice follow-up question, sort of moving on from dialect as well, which was about actually using words from another language. She's specifically talking about Welsh words. Again, how much that might contribute to a sense of place, so long as the reader can get the meaning of the word from the context. So I guess I'd like to hear any and all of our top tips for how we do this whole thing of making setting work really well. So Trevor, I'm going to come to you first, because I know I maybe didn't fully give you a chance to answer the previous question, but I'd love to start with you. Again, what you've already given us some really good kind of pointers and tips. So any sort of specifics you can give us for, how do we make this setting stuff work?
I mean, to be honest, Hilary answered the question exactly the same way I would have answered it. So that's fine. Everything about setting should come through your characters, I think. I mean, the thing that I could do, certainly with my trilogy set in Newcastle, because my characters were homeless, I could use the contrast of what was going on around them in the city compared to the way they're living. And it worked very well for me, because Newcastle is quite famously a party city. It's where people come to have fun. The streets at weekends are full of stag parties and hen parties. Even when there's a recession on, you can't move for people clubbing it. It's absolutely renowned that nobody wears any clothes up here. I wander around in t-shirts all through the winter, as does pretty much everybody. And I was able to use all that going on in the background while my main characters are sleeping in doorways, are sitting in alleyways, watching the whole world, having fun, whilst they're living a very different life. So the contrast worked very well for me without me having to hammer it over the head, if you like. So I think you can use contrast with your characters. If they're not experiencing the same things that everybody else is, it really adds, it adds to their situation, I think. So that was a good way for me. I also, I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, I think, about whether you use real places or real bits of the city or the village that you're using, or whether you fictionalize a place. I mean, I've done it both ways. The Newcastle books are set absolutely in the real world. Everything in the book is real. I don't think I've fictionalized anything apart from the name of the university, which I changed from Northumbria to Northumberland. It wasn't a big switch, and it was in exactly the same place. But my fictional village in Northumberland is in an area that I know precisely. I know exactly kind of where it is, but there's no village there. There are villages all over the place, but none of them were quite right for my book. None of them were the right size. None of them had the geography that I wanted. So everything around it is real. The places I mentioned, little snippets of areas around it are real. The village itself is fictional. So I think even if you create a fictional place, you can make it feel completely real by dropping in all kinds of real things that are happening all around that area. And people, I'm hoping, it's not out yet, so we'll see. I think Angela may have started reading it. But I hope that people will actually come to imagine that Coldburn, my fictional village, is a real place. And then maybe Trip Fiction will do a piece about it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Trevor.
I should have added also, somebody asked earlier, I saw in the questions, that I wandered all over Northumberland, tracking down little bits of information that I could use to make my fictional village seem as real as I could.
Yeah. So I think there's something to be said, isn't there, for on the ground research. I remember when I was writing Little White Lies, my first book, which is set in Lincolnshire, which is where I live. My editor wanted me to kind of just increase the descriptions of setting, because I think I don't put enough in often in the beginning. And actually I went to Grantham and I walked around, and it was amazing how many new ideas and, you know, just details that I could put in, and actually finding a house that I clocked as the house that the White family live in. I was like, that's where they live. It was like I recognized it in the real world, and I love when that happens.
You can be really lucky, Philippa, as well. On my travels, I just went hiking basically and wandered all over the place, and I wandered past a place called Winter's Gibbet in Northumberland. Yeah, exactly. And of course, you've got to go and see that. It sounded fascinating. And it's basically the location. This is quite macabre, but it's the location of the last person to be hung in Northumberland. And there was a plaque there that described this guy, and he had the same surname as my main character in You Can Run. So I was able to use that as a threat from one of the villains to my main character, that he would go the same way as one of his predecessors went. Which, you know, it was a fictional village with a fictional place, but that story is true, so it works very well if you actually visit these places and get the proper information on it.
Brilliant. And Heather, what about you? What specific tips do you have when we actually are sitting down, you know, to put our manuscripts together to create this clear and vivid and effective sense of place on the page that works well with our plot and characters? What are your top tips?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I totally agree with what other people have said about the fact that especially first person has to be about what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. In my book, the book's set over kind of multiple years in Edinburgh and multiple seasons. And it's similar to what you were saying about Newcastle. Edinburgh is such a different city in the summer. The festival's on, it's like, you know, really buzzing, loads of tourists. And then in winter, it's kind of very different. So I think seasonally, like if you can pick out the differences in the seasons, it's quite a nice way to bring the city to life. The other thing that I like to do is, like, in terms of, and this is very much thriller kind of related, is that if there's kind of a very sunny day and everything looks lovely and beautiful, but then there's kind of flies, you know, emerging from the food, is that kind of unexpected, kind of off-putting detail that's kind of sickening. And I think that for me, that's something that just works quite well for the thriller genre. Like, not everything's as it seems, you know, even things that are beautiful have that kind of horrible side. So I think that can work really well. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think, you know, it's really important that it's about how the characters perceiving their setting, and, you know, whether they loved the setting to begin with and the setting kind of turned on them. That's also quite an interesting thing, you know, if they, you know, when things are going well, it's this lovely place, and then when things start to go wrong, everything goes wrong and everything seems to be against them if it's kind of in the environment, things like that. So that would be my kind of tip.
Fantastic. And again, coming back to you, Hilary, and thinking again about your top tips for, again, creating an evocative and immersive sense of setting in your books. And again, I was really interested in what you were saying, Heather, that, you know, as the character might change, the sense of their environment might change as well, and you might use that in a way to show the arcs of the characters. But also, as Heather Hewitt has asked, you know, can we also have it that the setting can influence the plot? So rather than, you know, what's happening for the character, or what plot the character's going through, influencing how that character might be experiencing the setting. Because I know you were talking, Hilary, about in your book, you know, how the cliff in your, you know, in your setting is literally crumbling, and that is having a direct effect on your characters. So I wonder, again, as well as maybe your tips about how, you know, just how you write setting and how you what tactics you have for getting that right, you know, how do you think about the setting itself having a direct impact on the events of your story?
Well, yes, as you say, it does have a direct impact on the events, not only the crumbling cliff, but also the storm that happen, or storms that happen. But another thing I was going to say was that I've often heard people say that when you write dialogue, it must do more than one job. And I think the same is true of setting, because when we've talked about how setting is very much linked with the characters, and how, you know, you show your setting through the eyes of your characters. But another thing that setting descriptions can do is, as Heather said, with the flies and things, it sort of foreshadow and signal a mood change. So, you know, when you think about the vocabulary that you're using to describe your setting, and somebody asked a question about the effect you want your setting descriptions to have on your readers. So do you want them to perhaps subconsciously know that something in the future is going to happen, or you know, a particular type of event is going to happen? So, for example, in one of my early descriptions of the weather on the beach, when I describe the clouds, I've used the word shroud. So things like that, you know, will signal something to your readers. So that's one thing, and you can really manipulate your readers, if you like, to feel a certain way, or to suspect that something is coming up through your setting descriptions.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, Hilary. And yeah, I think really thinking about really specific word choice, and this doesn't mean you have to get all fancy pantsy and literary about it, you know, every single word, but if you imagine that you've got a scene which has a expanse of water and trees surrounding that. Now, if you use words like lapping, glistening, swaying in the breeze, lush, now those words are all conjuring up a sense of, you know, a pleasant environment, relaxing, safe. If you use words such as, you know, swelling, you know, shards of light on the water, you know, patches of dark between the trees, that same scene is going to create a very different effect on your readers. So yeah, I think I love what you're saying, Hilary, as well, about making setting you do more than one thing. You know, you can just give the reader an orientation to where that person is and what's around them, but the ways that you describe it are great. And like I'm just going to jump in and yeah, think of a little bit in I'll Never Tell, which is in the very first scene where the Julia and Paul, the parents of missing Chrissy, are basically driving you know, back home, hoping that she's gone back home. And just the opening bit is the street lights flash past, orange, black, swinging low over the windscreen, over our faces. It's fine, it's not fine, it's fine, but it's not. So just the mirroring of, you know, the light change as these people are driving along, you know, it's light, dark, and her thoughts are going, it's fine, it's not fine, it's fine, it's not fine. A little bit later in the scene, she's describing her husband in the car beside her and how the light is going over his face, light, dark, and she's starting to think about, do I trust him? Do I not? Do I trust him? Do I not? So again, just using these kind of things, using that kind of symbolism in your setting to capture the themes as well, and the subtext. Tom, what about you? What are your top tips for, you know, making setting work?
Well, it's difficult to add anything to some of the great advice that's been shared already. I mean,
all right, I'll move on to Nikki then. No, I'm kidding. Come on, Tom, give us your wisdom.
Certainly, like, you know, the sense, because I think the kind of fundamental point about my books is that it's my narrator is a sort of a stranger in a strange land. So he's speaking very much in the first person, so that brings you immediately into the setting. But to him, Italy is always something of a mystery. And so because he's trying to sort of get to the bottom, not just of the kind of mystery at hand, but also the mystery of Italy, he kind of describes the world around him. So that kind of immediately takes the reader into the story and into the place. And, you know, Bologna, as I said previously, is a very sort of mysterious city. It's a city of kind of closed doors, secret passageways, lots of hidden courtyards, and so on and so forth. And the characters themselves, you know, the Italian, Italian society is very, very different. You know, in the age of Ryanair, we kind of hop from one place to another, and a lot of places, you know, there seems to be this kind of homogeneity to the places that we go to. But when you actually spend time in a place, you come to realize that actually on a very deep level, it's very different. And that's the sort of thing that he wants to sort of explore. And that's the sort of thing that he comes to kind of, you know, discover. I mean, to him, you know, I anthropomorphize quite a lot. So
that's easy for you to say.
Yeah, it's easier to write than to and you know, for him, you know, Bologna is almost, and he kind of, you know, he often sort of describes Bologna like an animal. You know, it's like a sleeping animal, and it's a place that's very much alive with its roots in the kind of past, and it's seen everything that's kind of passed through. And you know, and he talks also about, because it's a medieval city, you know, he kind of evokes Shakespeare and, you know, being players on a stage. And so, you know, the Bologna, the city, is almost sort of like a giant stage, but a living stage, and it's one kind of watching people pass through. And there's very much that sense also in Italian culture of cities being living places, having their own sort of identity. And I very much try to sort of bring that, you know, make that felt in the narrative, but also on a kind of more basic kind of scale. You know, you use Italian phrases. You know, sometimes I get criticized for using too many Italian phrases, but what you say is, you know, you use a kind of an Italian phrase and then you immediately translate it, and things like that, just to give people a sense that they're actually in the place. But yeah, I mean, and also then of course there is the Italian food, which you can't avoid because it's such a kind of central kind of part of Italian life. Yeah, I mean, that's generally how one kind of evokes the sense of place, I think, the sense of setting.
Yeah, I love that idea of it being the setting, not just being a character, but in your books it being a creature character. And also how, like, you talk about that being part of Italian culture as well. And yeah, I think, yeah, that's really interesting to me. Like, yeah, and I think maybe it's like not a bad technique for all of us, you know, when we think about our locations, think about what character profile would you give to this location, and that will maybe help you make decisions about whether this setting and this location is the best one for the particular story that you're going to tell. Like, if you've got a glamorous cast of characters, you know, is your setting similarly glamorous, or you know, is that, or you know, again, would putting them in a very grungy setting kind of show an interesting contrast or whatever. Just before I come to you, Nikki, for your top tips on doing this whole setting, Yasmin Chopin has just put a note in the chat about her work on place within the genre of creative non-fiction. So she's got some articles on her Substack about that, which again might be really interesting for people to read if you want to explore some of these themes and ideas in creative non-fiction writing, which can include things like memoir, things like that. So she's put her link in the chat, so yeah, you can easily go and check that out. And I'll also just say, because someone did ask a question before, which is a totally valid question, which was, what's the difference between setting and sense of place? And the short answer is neither. I just thought they were both good words to put in the blurb for this event. And I think partly the phrase sense of place was partly inspired by a fun anecdote that I came across, which is about how the author and zoologist Gerald Durrell, who people may have heard of, who wrote lots of books about his zoology work, is the brother of a very serious literary author called Lawrence Durrell, who wrote books such as the Alexandria Quartet. And one of Lawrence Durrell's books was called Sense of Place. And Gerald Durrell, as his little brother, was always taking the piss out of Lawrence Durrell for being so pretentious. So he wrote his own book about his zoology adventures called Fillets of Place, as in place like the fish. I just thought that was quite funny. So I felt like I wanted to get sense of place in. I suppose setting is maybe more the technicality of the geography, and sense of place is maybe more the kind of descriptions and atmosphere. But yeah, put your own comments in the chat and let us know. But I didn't think it through very much, is the short answer. Nikki, what about you? What are your top tips for setting and sense of place?
Yeah, I think like Trevor, I was kind of fascinated by the idea of contrast. So although I've set my third novel in a very kind of luxurious place, on the surface all my characters are quite glamorous, I guess, but they are pretty kind of, a lot of them anyway, have a lot of issues, I would say, and a lot of kind of darkness in them. So I wanted that kind of contrast between a beautiful place and everything looks perfect on the surface, but then underneath it's absolutely not what you see at all. And I think that kind of ties back to what Heather was saying about, having something where everything looks beautiful and then suddenly, the food goes off and you see flies everywhere. It's that kind of idea. So, people are kind of, you're lulling your readers, I guess, into a kind of a full sense of security or whatever, that they're a beautiful place and it's a beautiful holiday and everything's going to be lovely, when in fact it's not at all. So yeah, I like the idea of kind of contrasts, and sometimes I think you can also get the setting to really contribute to a particular scene. So if it's hot, dusty, very uncomfortable, and your characters are suffering at the same time, you can kind of really amp up that tension, I think, and the feeling of uncomfortableness for them.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a cliche, but totally use the weather. Like I've got a scene in I'll Never Tell where Paul, Chrissy's dad, is going through a real kind of emotional crisis moment, and there's a big thunderstorm outside, and they're in an environment where it is like thundery anyway. It's not completely random, but I'm like, yeah, sod it, that, and because I think in real life, things don't really work like that, do they? There aren't these kind of connections and patterns, but in fiction we can make that stuff happen. So yeah, if someone's feeling very shamed or exposed or uncomfortable, yeah, make it boiling hot summer or whatever. Or if they're feeling very isolated, maybe make it really cold or whatever. You totally go for it, like we are the gods. and just switching back to you again, Tom, because you really helpfully talked a little bit about how you use Italian words and phrases, and Sally Skinner just wanted to kind of double check exactly how you might do that. So and I know someone else before was asking about using Welsh language. So saying, what do you think about including non-English dialogue in books set abroad? How and where might you include Italian phrases, for example? And I think you gave some really useful tips, Tom, on how you could make sure that the reader still understands, even if they don't speak that language?
Yeah, you can drop it in afterwards. Often, just like literally, for example, in the latest book I've written, a guy kind of comes down and he looking for an old lady, and he goes Zia, and then he just says that once, and then he goes Zia again, and then I go auntie, because he's calling for his auntie. So I just literally write auntie. It's kind of like, if you're reading it so quickly you don't really notice, but immediately oh, Zia means auntie, so he's looking for his auntie. So you kind of just like knock it in like that. It seems unnatural, but it actually just works. And funnily enough, in the same novel, right at the beginning, there's an epigram, a kind of a quote at the beginning, saying, and it's from a Neapolitan nursery rhyme, and obviously it's written in Neapolitan, but then afterwards I've put in the English translation, and that works for both the book, but then toward the end of the book, it's not giving too much away, I don't think. My central character, comes down somewhere, and he hears this old lady singing the same nursery rhyme, and I don't bother translating it. I just have one line, and then a kind of a description of how he feels, then another line, a description of how he feels, and so on. So it just kind of creates that sort of sense. But at the same time, one hopes that the reader will have, right at the beginning, have already read the translation, and so they'll have a sense of what she's singing about. So that's another way that I sort of kind of create that kind of mix of sense of place, without kind of hammering away too heavily.
Brilliant. So as we're nearing our time to finish, and I've got a couple of final questions for us to wrap up with, and I'm going to put them together and go around each of us. So first of all, what books would you recommend that you think really use setting and place really effectively, or that you've read that you've really enjoyed that aspect of the book? And the second part of the question is, where would you like to set a novel that you haven't yet had a chance to? So what's your kind of dream fictional location or real life location that you'd like to put in one of your fictional books? So let's start with Hilary. What about you? Any books that you would recommend?
I have. I read both of these books earlier this year. Let's get that there. Piranesi.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. And the setting is, completely crucial and integral to the book. I really recommend that. And the other one, which was, I think it came out a few years ago, but I've just read it, Dagger by Ben Smith, which is set, as you can see, on a wind farm in a sort of near future time. It's absolutely brilliant. So I really do recommend that. And my next novel, which I'm about a third of the way through the first draft of, I'm hoping to set it in an orchard, but I'm not sure if it's going to work. So we'll see. I'll have to keep trying with that one.
Sorry, what was the second one that you mentioned? Did you say Doggerland?
Doggerland, yeah.
Who's it by?
Ben Smith.
Oh, okay. I'm just searching the links on Amazon to put up for people so they can go straight away and find it. Very exciting. So we should look out for that new book from you.
Yes, it works with the sort of themes and everything, but I'm not sure how it's going to link with the plot at the moment.
Damn it, it's always annoying when you have to come up with a plot, isn't it? Like, oh, damn. And what about you, Nikki? Are there any books that you would particularly recommend? And what about a setting that you're either planning or would love to write in?
I would recommend Jane Harper's novels, both The Dry and The Lost Man, which were set in Australia for thrillers. I thought they were, the setting was incredible and definitely, you just felt that you were there, and I've never been there, so yeah, I thought they were brilliant. And another book as well called The Fields by Erin Young that I've just read, which is set in Iowa, again somewhere that I've never been to, but it's that kind of real agricultural farming kind of community in America, and I thought that was really brilliant as well. And in terms of settings for my books, my next one, which will be out in 2024, is set in the Maldives, so I'm hoping to get a visit there, quite frankly. So yes, right where you want to be, Trevor. So yes, that's what I've gone for. So
I need to learn from you, Nikki. I need to learn from you.
Yes, so yes, yeah, I'm doing lots of research at the moment, and it's making me just incredibly envious of anyone who's been there. So yes, I have Google up, and yeah, so yeah, that's where it'll be.
And Tom, what about you? What would you recommend, and where are you? Are you going to move away from Bologna at any point, or are you still digging into its mysteries?
Yeah, I mean, no plans at the moment to move away from Bologna, but well, having said that, so we work kind of backwards. Yeah, a place I'd love to write about actually would be the UK. So I'd really like to set a book in the UK, and maybe that might be a kind of a side project of mine.
Or why don't you make Daniel Lester go back to the UK and do a case there? That would be fun. That would be brilliant. And then he'd have like reverse culture shock.
Well, yeah, who knows? And in terms of settings, I thought about this before, and for me, really, my most compelling settings, most recently, have all been in the past. I'm really, fascinated with the past. I've always loved history anyway, but I recently read, just actually for a complete change, Robert Harris's A Gentleman and a Spy, about the Dreyfus Affair, which was just fantastic and was set in, France, of the kind of fin de siècle France. And that was just superb, just a fantastic book, both in history and the setting.
What was that
and
called?
actually,
Sorry, Tom?
I think it's called A Gentleman and a Spy. It's about the Dreyfus Affair by Robert Harris. It was just, fantastic. And in fact, it led me to read his latest, which was Act of Oblivion, another one set in England, just during the Reformation, when Charles II was it? No, that's not the Reformation, isn't it? What is that? I don't know. Anyway, when Charles II came back and basically wanted revenge on the people who had killed his dad. And so that was very good. And also the novels of Angela Carter, Knights of the Circus, Wise Children. My goodness, Knights of the Circus is probably, one of the greatest books around, set in the kind of really murky Victorian era that I've ever read, and it's one of my all-time favorite novels. And Wise Children as well, which is kind of around the 1910s, 1920s. She's just fantastic. So they would be the ones that I'd currently recommend.
Brilliant. And as I say, I'm putting lots of links in the chat for all of these books and authors. Heather, what about you? Would you have any best books that you would recommend, and anywhere that you're planning to set a book in the future?
Yeah, I'm actually so glad you mentioned Piranesi, because I read that last week and I just loved it and thought the setting was so clever. So glad you mentioned it. Going to go for an old one. Lesson Zero by Bret Easton Ellis is really good for LA. It's just, so well done, and very, it's very sparse. It's just brilliant. So I'm really excited to read The Shards as well.
I actually read that when it came out, which really ages me.
I didn't. It's brilliant. And then Tana French has written a great book called Broken Harbour.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which is so good, about the Irish kind of financial crisis, and it's set in a kind of this kind of housing estate that is supposed to be very luxury and has kind of been left and kind of very dilapidated, and it's just such a clever idea to kind of show this specific kind of time in history in Ireland. I love that book. So yeah, they'd be my two recommendations. To go back to Bret Easton Ellis, I'd probably love to set a book in LA, but I don't feel confident enough setting books in places that I haven't spent a lot of time. I know people do it, and I'm amazed and really impressed, but I think I'd have to kind of go somewhere or live somewhere to kind of actually commit to setting a book there, but LA would be good.
I think your publishers owe you a research trip.
Yeah.
If that ever, not that that ever really happens these days.
Nice and sunny.
Yeah. And what about you, Trevor? What books would you recommend, or authors would you recommend? And yeah, any sort of future settings for you?
I'm gutted I forgot about Broken Harbour. That's a fantastic book. I absolutely loved it. The setting's amazing. I feel like mine aren't quite good enough now because Broken Harbour is stupendous. But these are both very good, and one is real and one is fictional. So I would recommend a book called Easy Motion Tourist by Leah Adenli, who's a Nigerian writer. It's a kind of Tarantino-esque book set in Lagos, which is fascinating. He knows the city really well, and it's not a place that I was familiar with at all. I absolutely loved it. And my fictional one is a book that I think I might be the only person in England who's ever read, but it's called The Blinds, and it's by Adam Sternberg, and it's set in a slightly futuristic fictional town in America, which is kind of a compound where everybody in there is under some kind of witness protection scheme. They don't remember why they're in there because their memories have been wiped. So they're either villains who snitched on very dangerous people, or they're witnesses to crimes committed by very dangerous people. So they don't leave the compound because they think there might be people after them. And the claustrophobic setting is extraordinary. I loved it. So read that. As to my future settings, well, obviously following Nikki, the Seychelles is probably top of my list, I think. If only I could think of a crime to commit there. Probably. I mean, somebody could get killed by a falling coconut or something. I have no idea. Or one of the. I would probably opt for somewhere. I saw there was somebody from Ontario here earlier. I spend a lot of time in Canada. My daughter lives there. I know Vancouver really well, but I suspect there's a lot of Canadian crime writers who set their work in Vancouver. So I might go back to Ontario. I spent a lot of time in Ottawa, or Ottawa, as they call it. And a bit like Newcastle, it's quite a small city. And there's a big homeless population. So Ottawa, let's go for Ottawa in Canada.
Fantastic. And I will recommend, having derided Lawrence Durrell before with his sense of place, fillets of place, but actually Lawrence Durrell wrote one of my very favorite books, which is it's actually a sort of quartet of novels called the Alexandria Quartet, and it's set in Alexandria in Egypt, and it's, again, this talk about the setting being, you know, incredibly integral to the characters and plot, and yeah, I really love it. And in terms of places that I would like to set future books, so at the moment I'm right now I've just pitched 2 new novel ideas to my editor, and I'm waiting to hear her thoughts. One of them would take us to Bangkok in Thailand and the expat community out there. And the other would be to actually set a book in my hometown in Scotland, a fictionalized version of my hometown in Scotland, and a sort of thriller-esque homage to my childhood and teenage years. So I will let you know in due course which one, if either, my editor goes for, and hopefully I'll be able to, yeah, either go to Bangkok or go to my scruffy hometown, one or the other. Well, we're just about finished for the evening, and I want to thank our brilliant panelists for their time and their incredible insights and discussion this evening. You've been absolutely fabulous, guys. Again, I am just putting a link to all of our books in the chat for you. Please, if you've enjoyed this evening and you know, you've got something out of the discussion, please do support our brilliant panelists by checking out their books, and even if you don't buy one yourself, maybe recommend something to a friend, or just spread the word about these brilliant authors and their titles.
Philippa, can I get a quick plug in before we disappear?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry,
It's
Trevor.
it's very
And-
quick.
And Tom, I think you wanted to do a little plug as well. So yeah.
I just noted there was somebody from Southport earlier in the chat room, I noticed, and on the 21st, I'm doing a chat in Waterstones in Liverpool with Sarah Moorhead, who most of us know, who's a brilliant Liverpudlian writer, and Rob Parker, who's also from the area. If you could just pass that word on to anybody you know, because we need to sell some tickets. 21st of March, that is in Liverpool.
You mean you need to sell some more tickets, because
More
obviously
tickets, yeah,
are
that's what I
already
meant.
going flying out the door, but you don't want anyone to miss out.
Thanks, Zoe.
Tom, I think you might have had something to mention as well.
Yeah.
If you wanted to say.
Yeah, I've just posted a link to the 99p Kindle deal I have this month on the second novel. Where is it? It's here, The Hunting Season, which is all about a missing food taster, and it unravels a plot about truffles. And so if you're a fan of, this is the food one. This is the food one, guys. So, you know, if you like Italian food, this is for you. Try it, 99p.
Fantastic, Tom. Thank you. And again, a little reminder that the recording will go up on my YouTube channel. I'll pop the link for my YouTube channel in here, but it's very simple. Basically, if you go on to YouTube and Google or search on YouTube for Philippa East, you'll find my channel. You'll find recordings of some of the other panels that we've done previously, and the recording of this session will go up there hopefully a little bit later on this evening. So again, thank you so much, guys. Thank you, all of you, for coming, all of our brilliant audience members. Your questions and comments have been brilliant. We've really enjoyed chatting to you. The time has absolutely flown, and yeah, thank you, everyone, and happy reading, happy writing, happy traveling.